The moon hung behind them like a silent witness. Inside the B-17 Lucky 13, nothing worked the way it was supposed to anymore. The compass spun uselessly, its needle drifting in slow circles without purpose. The radio was dead. The hydraulic pressure had collapsed. Electrical instruments flickered, then faded into darkness. The bomber was no longer navigating. It was drifting. And the only thing standing between 10 men and the freezing black water of the North Sea was a 23-year-old navigator holding a slide rule he could barely see and a wristwatch he could only hope was still accurate. They had 28 minutes of fuel, maybe less. February 1945. The air over northern Germany was thick with smoke and fire. Hundreds of bombers carved slow, deliberate paths across the night sky, their formations glowing faintly in the moonlight like moving constellations. Below them, rail yards and industrial junctions burned under the weight of Allied strategy. Flak rose in violent black bursts, reaching upward in blind fury. Lucky 13 had survived the bombing run. For a while, her pilot, Captain Frank Becker, had already turned west, guiding the aircraft toward England. The crew relaxed slightly, tension bleeding from their shoulders. The dangerous part was over, or so they thought. The first engine failed without warning. Number 3 coughed, sputtered, then fell silent. The propeller windmilled briefly before Becker feathered it, reducing drag. No panic yet. The B-17 was designed for this. She could fly on 3 engines. Then number 4 died. The entire right wing sagged under asymmetric thrust. The bomber lurched sideways, fighting its own balance. Becker shoved rudder trim hard left, forcing the aircraft to stay level. Now it was serious. Now it was survival. Harold Webb, seated at his navigation station, looked up from his charts. The instruments in front of him flickered, their dim glow fading. The electrical system was failing. The intercom crackled once, then went silent. The bomber was alone, completely alone. No radio contact, no formation lights, no navigational beacons, just darkness. Becker's voice reached him through the emergency line. Webb, I need a heading. Not soon. Now. Because Becker already understood the truth. Webb was beginning to calculate. They weren't just damaged. They were lost. Harold Webb had never wanted to be a navigator. He wanted to fly. But during training in California, instructors noticed something unusual. While other cadets memorized procedures, Webb understood them. He didn't just follow navigation tables. He could derive them. He could predict drift before instruments confirmed it. He treated numbers like physical objects, things you could manipulate, rotate, test. So the Army Air Forces made him a navigator. He resented it at first. Navigators didn't touch the controls. They didn't feel the aircraft respond beneath their hands. They lived in shadows behind pilots who received the glory. But Webb learned something important. Pilots flew aircraft. Navigators flew reality. Because no matter how powerful the aircraft, if it didn't know where it was already dead. Before the war, Webb had worked as a surveyor in Oregon's Cascade Range. There were no roads, no landmarks, only forest and mountain and sky. A mistake of 5 degrees could leave you lost for days. He learned discipline, precision, obsession. Mistakes didn't announce themselves immediately. They waited. Then they killed you. By February 1945, Webb had flown 10 combat missions. He had never miscalculated once. Not once. Until now. Because now he had nothing left to calculate with. Lucky 13 descended into cloud. The world outside vanished into gray emptiness. The magnetic compass spun wildly, corrupted by electrical failure and the aircraft's violent imbalance. Without electricity, the gyroscopic instruments were useless. Webb tried to steady the compass card. It swung 20 degrees off-center, then 30, then back again. It wasn't navigation. It was noise. He looked at his chart. Their last confirmed position placed them roughly 280 miles from England. At their current speed and altitude loss, they might stay airborne for 40 minutes. Fuel exhaustion would come first. Ocean impact second. He ran the numbers again. Same answer. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Fear was irrelevant. Fear did not solve equations. He inventoried his tools. A slide rule, a flashlight, a sextant, a wristwatch, and a sky full of stars. If he could see them, if he could measure them, if he could trust them. Because celestial navigation didn't require electricity. It required mathematics. And mathematics never failed. He unclipped his harness and reached for the sextant. Above him, through the bomber's plexiglass dome, the clouds had thinned. The moon hung low on the horizon, brilliant and indifferent. It was enough. It had to be. He raised the sextant, bracing himself against the aircraft's shaking frame. The bomber lurched. The horizon shifted. The crosshairs danced wildly. He tried again. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. On the fourth attempt, he caught it. Moon altitude. Approximate. Imperfect. But real. He wrote the number down. Then checked his watch. Because time mattered as much as angle. Every second shifted celestial position. Every second altered survival. He opened his celestial tables and began to calculate. Not hoping. Not guessing. Calculating. Because somewhere beyond darkness and cloud and dying engines, England still existed. And Harold Webb intended to find it. The bomber was still descending. Harold Webb could feel it through his boots. A slow, steady sinking, like an elevator whose cables had been quietly cut. The engines on the left wing roared at full power, their vibration transmitted through the fuselage in a constant, desperate tremor. On the right side, there was only silence and drag. Lucky 13 was no longer flying efficiently. She was surviving inefficiently. And survival burned fuel faster than efficiency ever could. Webb bent over his navigation table, shielding his dying flashlight with his hand. The beam flickered weakly, yellow and unreliable, but it was enough. His slide rule clicked softly as he aligned its scales. Numbers emerged from darkness, one careful movement at a time. Moon altitude, time, declination, Greenwich hour angle. Each value was a fragment of truth. Alone, useless. Together, everything. He worked quickly, but never rushed. Rushing caused mistakes. Mistakes caused death. The aircraft lurched again. The sextant slipped in his grip, striking the edge of the table. He caught it before it fell, his fingers tightening instinctively around the worn metal frame. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. From cold. From adrenaline. From responsibility. Because 9 other men were trusting him with their lives, even if they never said it aloud. 10 minutes passed. Then 12. Finally, Webb stopped moving. He had a position. Not exact. Not perfect. But real. They had drifted north. Farther north than he expected. Wind had pushed them off course during the engine failure. Invisible and relentless. Without correction, they would have missed England entirely, sliding past it into the empty Atlantic, where fuel exhaustion would finish what mechanical failure had begun. He plotted the heading carefully. 265 degrees. West. Almost exactly west. He checked it once. Then again. Then a third time. The number did not change. It never did. Truth did not care how many times you questioned it. He folded the chart and crawled forward through the narrow fuselage, past the waist gunners who watched him with silent eyes. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They already knew the stakes. He tapped Becker's shoulder and held up the heading. Becker glanced at the chart, then at Webb. He nodded once. No hesitation. Because trust, once earned, did not require explanation. Becker adjusted the controls. The bomber resisted, dragging against asymmetric thrust, but slowly, reluctantly, she turned. The moon shifted position. The nose aligned west. Toward home. Or toward nothing. There was no way to know yet. Minutes passed in silence. The bomber descended through 10,000 feet. Then 8,000. Clouds swallowed them again, thick and impenetrable. There were no stars now. No horizon. No reference. Only instruments that no longer worked and faith in calculations made under impossible conditions. Webb returned to his station and took another sextant reading. Harder now. The aircraft shook more violently as airspeed dropped. He waited for a moment between vibrations and captured another angle. Then another calculation. The result matched the first. They were still on course. He allowed himself a single breath of relief. Not safety. Never safety. Only reduced uncertainty. The altimeter read 5,000 feet. Fuel gauges dropped steadily toward empty. In the cockpit, Becker spoke quietly over the emergency line. Prepare for ditching. The words carried no emotion. Just fact. Ditching in the North Sea in February meant death within minutes. The water temperature hovered just above freezing. Survival time measured in single digits. The crew began throwing weight overboard. Ammunition belts vanished into darkness. Machine guns followed. Anything that could extend flight by seconds. Seconds mattered now. Seconds were life. Webb ignored it. Because his job was not to prepare for death. It was to prevent it. He raised the sextant again. The moon was lower now, closer to the horizon. Harder to measure. Harder to trust. But still there. He took the reading. Calculated again. Still west. Still correct. Still hope. Then, through a break in the clouds, he saw it. At first, he thought it was imagination. A faint smudge against darkness. Then it grew. A line. A shape. A boundary between sea and land. Coastline. England. He froze for half a second, verifying what his eyes already knew. Then he shouted, "Land ahead." The words exploded through the aircraft. Every man turned toward the windows. And there it was. Solid. Real. Impossible. Becker didn't celebrate. He acted. Landing gear cranked down manually. Each rotation of the emergency handle a physical struggle. Without hydraulics, every motion required brute force and determination. The bomber descended toward the runway, engines sputtering as fuel starvation approached its inevitable conclusion. No flaps. No proper control. Only gravity and skill. The wheels struck hard. The aircraft bounced once. Twice. Then slammed down and slid across the runway in a storm of sparks and dying momentum. The engines coughed. Stopped. Silence returned. Absolute and overwhelming. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. They were alive. They had crossed 280 miles of darkness without instruments, without compass, without radio, guided only by mathematics. And one man who refused to guess. The bomber rolled to a stop in silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The engines were dead. The vibration that had filled their bodies for hours was gone, leaving only stillness and the sound of cooling metal ticking in the cold night air. Harold Webb sat at his navigation table, his hands still resting on the chart. They were trembling now, not from fear, but from release. The calculations were finished. The outcome had already been decided. Behind him, crew members began unstrapping themselves slowly, as if sudden movement might break whatever fragile miracle had carried them this far. Becker opened the hatch. Cold air rushed inside. England. Real. Solid. Impossible England. They climbed down onto unfamiliar concrete, their legs weak from cold and exhaustion. A jeep approached from across the airfield, headlights cutting through mist. A British officer stepped out and looked up at the wounded bomber, its engines silent, its paint scarred by war. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Becker didn't answer. He looked at Webb. Webb stepped forward, still holding the chart. He pointed west across the darkness. "Germany," he said simply. The officer studied him, then the chart, then the bomber itself. 2 engines dead. Electrical systems gone. Radio silent. "How did you navigate?" he asked. Webb hesitated for a moment, then held up the sextant. "The moon," he said. Word of the flight spread quietly, not as propaganda, not as legend, but as proof. Navigators began practicing celestial fixes more seriously. Backup procedures were emphasized. Instructors reminded crews that instruments could fail, but mathematics could not. Webb flew 18 more missions before the war ended. He never spoke much about that night. When asked, he always gave the same answer. "I just followed the numbers." After the war, he returned to Oregon and resumed his life as a surveyor. He measured roads instead of skies. He raised a family. He lived quietly. But in his study, he kept 3 objects: a slide rule, a wristwatch, and a sextant, not as trophies, as reminders. Because on one February night in 1945, when the compass failed and the world disappeared into darkness, those simple tools had done what machines could not. They brought 10 men home, not by luck, but by preparation, and by a navigator who never stopped calculating.